Welcome to MogulCast, where we uncover the stories behind the world's greatest business empires. Let's get into today's story.
Steve Jobs stood outside Apple's headquarters in 1985, locked out of the company that bore his fingerprints on every product, every ad, every decision, fired from the business he had built in a garage. 12 years later, he would walk back through those doors as CEO. Decades after that, Apple would become worth more than $3 trillion, one of the most valuable companies ever built. This is the full story, and it is worse than you think. Steve Jobs co-founded Apple in 1976 alongside Steve Wozniak, building the first machines by hand and selling them out of a garage in Los Altos, California. Jobs had no formal engineering training. He was the visionary and the salesman, obsessed with design at a time when computers were beige boxes for hobbyists. When Apple went public in 1980, Jobs became a multi-millionaire almost overnight. But the same intensity that built Apple would soon put him on a collision course with the very board he had assembled. We will come back to one specific decision. It is the key to everything. In 1983, Jobs personally recruited John Sculley away from Pepsi with a now famous challenge. Did Sculley want to sell sugar water for the rest of his life, or come change the world? Sculley became Apple's CEO, and for a while the partnership worked. But as Apple's early product missteps piled up in the mid-1980s, tensions between Jobs and Sculley grew. Jobs believed in his own instincts above all else. Sculley, backed by the board, began to believe Jobs was becoming a liability to the company he had co-founded. By 1984, Apple had launched the Macintosh, introduced to the world with the legendary 1984 Super Bowl ad, a defiant, cinematic declaration that Apple would not be another faceless tech giant. The Macintosh brought the graphical interface and the mouse into everyday life, a radical leap from command-line computing. Jobs treated the Mac team like artists, pushing them past exhaustion for a product he believed would change computing forever. For a moment, it looked like Jobs and Apple could do no wrong. But the Macintosh sold far below Jobs' expectations, and the tension inside Apple's boardroom kept building. Jobs ran the Macintosh division almost as his own company within the company, clashing openly with Sculley over strategy, pricing, and control. Behind closed doors, executives began quietly siding with Sculley. Jobs was still the face of Apple to the public, the visionary in the black turtleneck. But not everyone was celebrating. Popular version of this story says Jobs was simply pushed out by a jealous board. But here is what the media completely got wrong about this. In May 1985, Sculley moved to strip Jobs of his operational authority, and Apple's board sided with Sculley, not out of jealousy, but because Apple's earnings had genuinely stalled and investors were losing confidence. Jobs resigned from Apple that September. He wasn't just outmaneuvered. The company he built had, on paper, outgrown him. Losing Apple did not stop Jobs. It redirected him. He immediately founded a new computer company, NeXT, aimed at high-end workstations for universities and business. A year later, he bought a small computer graphics division from Lucasfilm for roughly $10 million and renamed it Pixar. Almost nobody, including Jobs himself, expected Pixar to become the bigger bet. Both companies would struggle financially for years, but both were quietly building the tools that would define Jobs' second act. While Jobs rebuilt outside its walls, Apple was falling apart inside them. Through the early to mid-1990s, Apple burned through CEOs. Sculley, then Michael Spindler, then Gil Amelio, while its market share collapsed against Microsoft Windows and a wave of cheaper PC clones. Product lines multiplied into confusing, overlapping catalogs that even Apple's own employees struggled to explain to customers. By the mid-1990s, analysts openly speculated that Apple might not survive as an independent company. In December 1996, Apple's leadership made a desperate bet. They acquired Jobs' NeXT for its operating system technology, bringing Jobs back into the building as an informal advisor. Within months, CEO Gil Amelio was pushed out by the board, and in 1997 Jobs stepped in as interim chief executive, the same man who had been forced out 12 years earlier, now walking back through Apple's doors to save it. He inherited a company hemorrhaging money, with dozens of confusing products and a brand that had lost its edge. Jobs' first move stunned Apple's own employees. He slashed the product line down to a handful of computers, killed unprofitable projects, and struck a deal for a $150 investment from Microsoft, Apple's fiercest rival, just to keep the company solvent. He launched the Think Different campaign not to sell a product, but to sell an idea. That Apple stood for something again. And if you have made it this far, you already understand something most analysts completely missed. Jobs didn't save Apple by expanding it. He saved it by making it small enough to focus. What followed was one of the most dramatic corporate turnarounds in business history. The iMac launched in 1998 and became an instant hit. The iPod arrived in 2001, putting 1,000 songs in people's pockets and reshaping the music industry. Then, in 2007, the iPhone redefined what a phone could even be, followed by the App Store in 2008 and the iPad in 2010. Each product built on the last, turning Apple from a struggling computer maker into a device company that touched nearly every part of daily life. Jobs did not live to see Apple's full ascent. He was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer in 2003, underwent a liver transplant in 2009, and resigned as CEO in August 2011, handing the role to Tim Cook. He died on October 5, 2011. But the foundation he rebuilt kept compounding under Cook's leadership. Apple crossed $1 trillion in market value in 2018, then $2 trillion in 2020, milestones no American company had ever reached before. Remember that decision we mentioned at the start, the one that would define everything. It was the board's choice to strip Jobs of power and push him out in 1985 to dot. Here is what it actually cost, and what it ultimately built. Those 12 years in exile forced Jobs to fail at NeXT, succeed at Pixar, and return to Apple as a sharper, more disciplined leader than the one who left. The firing that nearly ended his career became the origin of the comeback that built Apple into a company worth over $3 trillion. By the numbers, Apple was founded in a garage in 1976. Steve Jobs was pushed out in 1985 and returned in 1997 to a company on the brink of collapse. Microsoft's $150 million lifeline kept Apple afloat that same year. Apple crossed $1 trillion in value in 2018, $2 trillion in 2020, and became the first company in history to touch $3 trillion in 2022. Jobs died in 2011. He never got to see Apple reach that final milestone. Here is the insight most casual viewers miss. Jobs' firing wasn't a detour from Apple's success, it was a prerequisite for it. The Jobs who returned in 1997 was not the same impulsive perfectionist who left in 1985. He had learned focus at NeXT and patience at Pixar, two companies that forced him to build teams and processes instead of relying purely on instinct. The most valuable comeback in business history didn't happen despite the fall. It happened because of it. Apple's story shows that the worst moment in a founder's career is not always the end of it. Sometimes it's the beginning of the version that actually wins. If you want to understand how this pattern repeats across every major business collapse, the next video covers a story with disturbing parallels. That one is next.
That's the story for today on MogulCast. If you found this valuable, subscribe and hit the bell. A new Empire story drops every single weekday. See you tomorrow.